from the Washington, D.C. area. It's the Inside Scoop, all the news that our viewers want to know. Now, here's the host.
Welcome to Inside Scoop. This is Election Eve, and I am your host, Catherine Reed. Joining me tonight is someone very renowned in Northern Virginia and Virginia politics, Ben Tribbett. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you, Catherine.
So I'm very excited tonight. You know, all the cool kids are kind of at George Mason University because that's where Ann Holton and Tim Kaine and Joe Biden are. But you and I are going to be doing the heavy lifting of prognosticating this evening.
You got it.
So let's talk about, I guess we can talk about the national races first. So let's talk just a little bit about how you're feeling, oh great Swami, for Hillary going into tomorrow's election.
You know, we went through a whole year of misery here watching this whole campaign play out, and the race really hasn't changed that much from a year ago, which is the Democrats have a huge electoral college advantage that's sort of built in and only need to win one or two key states in order to win this election. And I think Hillary will be able to do that tomorrow.
So what do you think all of this has been about? Like, you're right, it has been a grueling, grinding year, the Comey letter, the ups, the downs. Was there ever really a path for Trump? And if there wasn't a path for Trump, why has the media handled it this way?
There's a path for Trump, but it's a narrow path. You know, I mean, there's 242 electoral votes that have gone Democratic since 1992. And so, short of breaking that, what's called a blue wall, Hillary was always right on the cusp of 270 to begin with. So is there a path for Trump? Yes, but it always involves sweeping the swing states. And the problem that Trump really had in the swing states is the swing states are not all the same. And so one swing state might have a large Latino population, another one might be heavily young people, another one could be heavily union and older and white, like Ohio. And so to win all of those states really requires an overwhelming victory for the Republicans in a lot of demographic groups, because they can't afford to have one group carry them. And I think that's really the shortcoming of Trump's candidacy. While he's performing very well among whites without college degrees, that doesn't carry you in every state.
So let's talk about what a lot of people refer to as identity politics, which has gotten to be this ugly, terrible word we're not supposed to talk about. The fact that gender makes a difference, your minority status makes a difference, whether you have a college degree makes a difference, but all of that's come to the forefront in this particular race. You know, we've heard about white voters before, but suddenly now there's this subgroup of white working class voters with no college degree. Are they a force? Is this something that going forward in other elections we need to be focused on these people and how they're voting?
You know, part of the problem the Democrats have had in midterm elections is you never want to say any group is someone you don't focus on. But this has been a group we've been underperforming in for quite some time, and Trump is just the latest version of this. Mitt Romney won white voters overwhelmingly in 2012, but with large minority turnout, that really didn't matter. And people see the gender gap and they assume, well, women are Democrats and men are Republicans. Well, really, white women are overwhelmingly Republicans still.
Married white women.
And married white women are even worse.
Married white women. And
so, but they see the women's number and they don't realize the reason the women's number is driven is because 96% of African American women are voting Democratic, 80-some% of Latino women are voting Democratic. That's what's driving the women vote to be +6, +8 Democratic overall. Amongst men, we've had a problem with white men for decades. Every time you have an election and you see standing at the polls a lot of white men coming to vote, you know it's a Republican year. And Trump has just pushed that even further. But I think that part of it's driven by the fact that some of these older white men, you know, have been moving Republicans since the president's election. They're not really comfortable with an African-American president. And then you put on top of that, are they really comfortable with a woman president? And so the Democrats are sort of pushing the envelope amongst that part of the electorate by creating history. Are they more comfortable with a Bill Clinton? Sure. Do we need them anymore? Not really, but we sort of do need them in midterm elections. And that's what creates sort of this interesting dissection of, it's very hard to win without them in a midterm because they're older and older people vote. But in a presidential year, you don't really need them at all, and they know no one cares about them.
Wow. So talking about the Latino vote, you know, in Obama's wins in both 2008 and 12, a lot of significance was put on the vote of African Americans, but particularly African American women. Mm-hmm. When Terry McAuliffe won the governorship, there was a lot of the of the numbers that came back from the exit polls, it was African American women who put him over. Going forward, is the story of this election going to be the Latino voter?
You know, it could be in some swing states. We got to see how Nevada turns out tomorrow. You know, I used to live in Las Vegas, and it has a tremendous Latino population, but traditionally there, the Latinos have not always participated at the levels in which their population indicates. Now, remember, part of what always keeps down the minority vote, and this applies to African Americans and Latinos, is that the average age is younger.
Right.
And so when people say, well, they have much lower turnout, actually a 65-year-old African-American man and a 65-year-old Latino man and a 65-year-old white man are all about the same propensity to vote. The problem is that there's a lot more younger minorities than there are younger white people. And so overall their turnout goes down, especially in midterm elections.
Right.
And so, you know, for the Latino vote, there's states where it matters. Nevada, I think, is an interesting one because there's two pieces that are going on there. One, you've got a Latino surge potentially for Hillary, and two, a big chunk of the Republican vote there, especially in the rural areas, is Mormon. And Trump has been underperforming badly among Mormons. You've seen it in Utah.
Yeah, Utah.
But that's a softness in the Republican vote in that state that's going to hurt him. There's an older population there that's really driving why he's able to get it close, because there are a lot of older retired people who like to retire to Las Vegas.
Right.
But those two pieces make it very difficult for him to carry the state.
And there are a lot of pockets of retired white people. Florida, Arizona, and Nevada are the three that leap out as being places where people have migrated to those states as fairly affluent white retirees.
And interestingly enough, all three of them are also the heavily Latino states.
Right.
So you have both of those two groups sort of battling each other out, and that's how they become swing states. You know, obviously the states that don't have these groups that are fighting it out, they're not swing states. There's also states where a lot of older white people retire, like Texas. Not a swing state.
Right.
So, you know, it's really a turnout operation in terms of who's going to come out in these swing states. And Hillary's had some softness among African-American turnout early on. That's why people were so concerned about Michigan this week. But overall, I think in a presidential year, generally, people tend to vote.
Right.
And so assuming that we don't have any sort of massive, you know, turnout advantage tomorrow, Hillary should win. She should get over 300 electoral votes. We should call this race around 11 o'clock. The Senate, the House, we'll have to wait and see. But I think it's going to be a comfortable night for the Democrats.
So talking about the down ballot races, the House, I mean, we've got some interesting House races here in Virginia, but Senate races across, I've heard the number 9 as a possibility of 9 Democratic senators. Do you think that's a realistic number? Which ones are you think are the most likely, or we have the best opportunity to turn Democratic in the Senate?
Well, the Senate's you always have to remember whatever cycle you're in, because it's a 6-year cycle, what you're dealing with from that class of senators. So this class of senators is the 2010 wave midterm Tea Party senators.
Okay, right.
And that's why there's so many Republicans in blue states, because it was a year where the Republicans really surged.
It was a bloodbath.
Even before that, the cycle before that was 2004, down ballot from President Bush's reelection. So there has not been a major Democratic wave year in this cycle of senators since 1986. So over time, Republicans have tended to win the swing seats and even slightly blue seats in this class. So there's a lot of very good opportunities for the Democrats. Pennsylvania, Illinois, places, Wisconsin, places that you would expect them just based on the margin for the presidential candidate to pick up. Now, Nevada, again, very competitive race, open seat of Senator Reid. Probably going to go along with what happens up ballot, so slight advantage to the Democrats to hold that. And so if they're able to hold that seat and win those 3 other seats, that'd put them at +3. Democrats need 4 to control the Senate, assuming Hillary wins.
Right.
There's a few other good targets. I would say right now there's probably 3 or 4 others that are close, but it's hard to tell in a Senate race because polling this year has been so it's been a hard year to poll. And part of the reason it's been a hard year to poll is it's been a very volatile news cycle. And I do polling for local candidates, and I can tell you the thing that you hate more than anything is running a poll while news is breaking.
Right.
Because you want to run a poll when it's quiet and when people have had a chance to let information settle to see, all right, here's a snapshot of where it is right now. We really haven't had a lot of opportunities to breathe in this cycle. News has been breaking all the time, and so you're seeing a lot of spikes back and forth between the candidates. One thing that you've seen consistently, Republicans have outperformed the top of the ticket in the Senate races. And I think part of that, and you'll see in the exit polls tomorrow, will be driven by there's a chunk of Hillary Clinton voters that don't like Hillary Clinton,
right,
that are voting for her because she's not Donald Trump.
Right.
Most of those people are going to want to place a check on her. And so she needs to win in a swing seat. Hillary probably needs to win by 6, 8, 10 to bring a Democratic candidate with her. Whereas in the past, if you won a state by 2 or 3, you might be able to bring with it. I'll give you an example. Virginia 2012. The president won the state by, I think, 4 or 5 points, and Tim Kaine came in with 1 point higher than him. But precinct to precinct, it was virtually identical. Had the president lost Virginia, Tim Kaine would have lost in his race against George Allen. So this year, we're going to trail a little bit behind the top of the ticket, and I think it'll be a late night. I saw a couple of prognosticators today predicting a 50-50 Senate. That's possible. It's a great scenario for Virginia in that Tim Kaine would immediately leave office to go to become vice president. Governor McAuliffe would appoint his replacement, which would keep the Senate 50-50, but we would actually have the special election this November, which would potentially be control of the Senate in a special election in Virginia in 2017.
See, that's what I think is so interesting, and as we get deeper into the show, this is exactly the kind of thing I want to talk about, is sort of this ripple effect of how these races are going to specifically affect people moving around here inside the Commonwealth of Virginia. And certainly Tim Kaine leaving his Senate seat, we've got like 9 months where someone is safely appointed in the first part of Hillary's administration, but then come November 17th, the Republicans will mount a formidable campaign. And, you know, talk a little bit about how that generally tends to work when you've got one party in power and how that galvanizes the other party that's not in power.
Right, and so generally speaking, up until this last time when Terry McAuliffe won the election, Virginia had gone for the party that was not in the presidency, because it does galvanize. I think it had been the last 8 governor's elections prior to that, which are held the year after a presidential, which would be the same as this Senate race.
And we are there are only 2 states that have off-year elections, us and New Jersey.
For governor, that's right.
For governor. It's with only 2 states left out of 50, and we are the only state left in the union that has a 1-term governor,
right,
the last one. So yes, so what happens? So Terry McAuliffe breaks the curse, as it had been called, because normally what happens is that, you know, the party not in the White House gets into the governor's mansion. When we come back, we will discuss more of this with Ben Tribbett, my guest tonight, as we prognosticate about the election. Hi, I am Peggy Knight, and I'm with the League of Women Voters of the Fairfax area, and I'm here to share information about Election Day with the viewing audience of the Fairfax Public Access Television area. Election Day is Tuesday, November 8th. Do you know that you can vote for more than just the president and the vice president? Every representative in Congress is up for election this year. But that's not all you can vote for on Election Day. There are 2 proposed constitutional amendments for Virginia. There is a meal tax referendum, and there are 3 separate bonds to vote on. For more information about these issues and the candidates, go to vote411.org. Remember, Election Day is November 8th, and your vote is your voice, and every vote counts.
There's more than just books at the library.
There's more than just books at the library.
Excuse me.
There's more than just books at the library.
Il y a plus que de livres à la bibliothèque.
Hello. You have a lot of great books here today. You know there's more than just books at the library.
I know.
There's more than just books at the library.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your hosts.
Welcome back to Inside Scoop, our Election Eve edition. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and joining me tonight is Ben Tribbett, a well-known, very renowned prognosticator in politics.
Beloved.
Beloved. And beloved, too.
Beloved.
And beloved prognosticator of politics here in Virginia. Thank you so much for being here, Ben.
Glad to be here.
So I want to talk a little bit, when we left at the break, we were talking about Virginia politics specifically, and how when one party's in the White House, historically, it galvanizes, and this is what we see in midterm elections too, it galvanizes the other party to
Turnout.
Yeah, the turnout is galvanized. People are motivated by the fact it's like, we don't want another one of these, right?
Right, absolutely.
So heading into this election, there's 11 congressional districts in Virginia. I don't know that people are aware of that, but 11 congressional districts in Virginia. Out of that congressional district, I would mention a couple of things, like we've only got one woman out of that, and she is in a very competitive race.
We're guaranteed to keep a woman.
That's right, with Lou Ann Bennett. So let's talk a little bit about how Virginia looks. So Virginia looks on paper, and I think we have a map here of our congressional districts that we can show you, that when you look at the congressional districts in Virginia, we are not very blue. I mean, people talk about Virginia as being a blue state. Look at this, the last two presidential elections, blue, governor blue. But if you look at how Virginia looks, it's very red, and some of these districts are huge in the rural areas, like the 9th district, the Fighting 9th down in Southwest Virginia, and the 5th, which runs down the center of the state. And so it becomes increasingly, in these more rural parts of the state, finding candidates that can fill these seats. So the little blue areas that we see on that map are very densely, highly populated areas of the state. So in this one particular race that's gotten a lot of national attention, it's Lou Ann Bennett and Barbara Comstock. Do a little prognosticating on exactly how you think this may go.
Well, this is one where the DCCC, which is the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, targeted early on. They recruited Lou Ann Bennett to run long before anyone in Northern Virginia that had known her from her prior political involvement. She had been married to Congressman Moran.
Correct.
So many people knew her from that, but they didn't realize that she was interested in running for office herself. She was being trained by the DCCC last year before anyone even knew she has an interest in the seat. She moved out to Virginia to run, and I think on paper would be not the strongest Democratic candidate. However, where the DCCC saw a strength in her of why they wanted her to run is, number one, she had an ability to do some self-funding, which she's done a limited amount of, and number two, that with Trump potentially being the Republican candidate for president, that the 10th district might be in a wave type of year. Obviously, educated white women are Trump's biggest weakness in this election. The population of the 10th district is full of educated white women. And so Barbara Comstock knows that Hillary Clinton is going to carry her district. The question is by how much, and how much can she break that ticket voting? Now, Lou Ann Bennett has raised less money than Comstock for her own campaign committee, but the DCCC has come in to back her up to sort of even things out. The DCCC's messaging is a little bit more difficult when you're a candidate because you're not controlling it.
Right.
And so it's hard to tell, if Miss Bennett supports exactly what's being said. I think it's somewhat her message that they've got, but it's a little bit different. It's a little bit more generic. And I thought when Lou Ann was on television, and if you notice, she hasn't been on TV in a while. The DCCC has been on TV the last couple of weeks because she sort of ran out of money. When Lou Ann was on with her own TV ads, I felt like early in this race she made a big strategic error. The first TV ad was about how we don't need partisanship. Her whole path to victory was partisanship.
Being carried by the wave of a Democratic victory in that district.
Right, so making this argument that voters should be looking beyond party, it was almost like it was Barbara Comstock's message. And I'm sure it tests well in a poll. If you ask people, would you like to look beyond party? Yes, I would. But her message needed to be, I think, more directly to voters, and it's what the message has turned into in the last few weeks here. If you're voting for Hillary, you should vote for me because we need to make her successful. And that's a stronger message than we don't need partisanship, because we don't need partisanship is a Barbara Comstock message. And Barbara's a bad messenger for that message, being someone who was very involved in the Clinton investigations in the 90s. In this district, she should be on paper toast. Because you would not think that someone who was involved in investigating Hillary Clinton and the Clintons would be winning Clinton crossover voters to win re-election. But somehow she's sort of doing it, and I think it's because the Democrats are letting her do it. I will tell you, Catherine, I've been surprised. I'd heard for years about, never lived in any of Barbara's districts. I just moved there this year. What a great constituent service she had, and how she was always on the ground and people saw her everywhere. I've barely seen her since I moved to the 10th. I'm at a lot of functions because, I work in, and I've been shocked at how little I've seen her. I will tell you that I had to do some outreach to her office earlier this year on a constituent issue, and they never got back with me. And I called a couple other people who had mutual contacts with the office to say, hey, they never got back with me. And they said, well, they're not always comfortable calling back Democrats. And I'm like, whoa, all right, this,
wow.
So I don't think that her reputation holds up when you watch it of what her office does. At least her staff certainly doesn't hold it up. But for voters in a presidential year, they don't see this up close. In an off year, when you get lower turnout, you get more educated voters that know the candidates. This is voters that are just going on gut feeling based on TV ads. Right. I think Barbara's had better TV ads, and I think she goes into Election Day with a slight advantage over Luann for that reason. However, if Hillary Clinton can win the district by double digits, it's going to be virtually mathematically impossible for Comstock to hang on.
All right, so let's talk about another interesting race for an open seat in the 5th District. That is Hurt's seat. He decided not to run for re-election. In the first wave in 08...
We used to call that Tom Perriello's seat.
Well, I was about to say in 08, Tom Perriello rode that same tide you were just talking about, being able to carry Luann Bennett in the 10th. Tom Perriello rode that into the 5th, and so for a brief time, for 2 years, we had this marvelous Democratic congressman from the 5th, and since then it's been Republican. So what do you prognosticate as being the chances that Jane Dittmar can prevail?
It's a little harder for Jane Dittmar than it was for Tom Perriello the first time, because we had a redistricting in 2012 that when the seats came back up, and they dragged that seat further out. It's a little bit more Republican. Tom Garrett is not a great candidate, and I think that's where she has her best opportunity. He's a state senator, has never had a competitive race before, and I don't think that he really plays well. That having been said, he has such an overwhelming partisan advantage. It's hard to imagine that Hillary Clinton will carry the 5th. If she can get across the finish line in the 5th, I think Jane Dittmar will actually run right with Hillary. And she could absolutely be brought in on a wave. It may only take a 1 or 2 point Hillary victory in the 5th to bring in Jane Dittmar. But right now you got to figure, based on where those voters are, that Donald Trump's a favorite in the 5th, and it's hard to imagine a lot of Trump-Dittmar voters.
Right. I think the only thing that 5th really has going for it is Charlottesville, right? I mean, that's that very narrow, it runs right through this. It's a lot of rural area, but you do have small towns like Charlottesville, and in fact, most places
Martinsville.
that have a university, even down in Southwest Virginia, Montgomery County, because of Radford University and Blacksburg, in the last 2 elections tend to go blue, just because there's that little bastion of
students and liberal college professors?
Yes, like that. Well, yes, like that. So, yeah, that's the 5th. Let's talk about Donald McEachin's race. And so Donald McEachin is, and that was a redistricting. Why don't you explain a little bit about how that...
So a judge struck down our districts.
Right.
And the 4th District, which had been, it's interesting because the 4th District opened up, Norm Sosiski had represented it for a long time. And in 2000, he died, right before the redistricting. And we had an incredible special election there, just so polarizing, between State Senator Randy Forbes and State Senator Louise Lucas. And there was a lot of Democrats felt race baiting that went on in that race. Forbes won by, I think, just 1,000 votes and went to Congress. And the Republicans immediately drew out most of the African-American vote in the district. The district had most of all of Portsmouth, all of Chesapeake, and was a Hampton Roads Senate seat. Now it had thrown out Portsmouth to the 3rd and went around Portsmouth, taking in Chesapeake, running out through Isle of Wight, coming up all the way to Chesterfield County and the Richmond suburbs, and being a Republican stronghold. Wow. Well, the judge threw out the 4th district, created the 3rd district more on the peninsula for Bobby Scott, and made the 4th district a lot of African-American neighborhoods in Richmond, all the way down, including now Portsmouth, into Chesapeake. Heavily Democratic. Donald McEachin is going to win it easily. And it's going to create a ripple effect, as we talked about before the show, of now Donald McEachin's state Senate seat will be open. Right, and so we can go down a little bunny trail, because it's our show and we can do what we want. So what are you anticipating as far as the move up person for that Senate seat? There's 2 delegates who live in the seat. Jennifer McClellan has expressed an interest, so has Lamont Bagby. I think the Richmond mayor's race will actually play a big role in who moves up there. Jennifer is very affiliated with LeVar Stoney. If he's able to find a way to win the Richmond mayor's race, I think she'll be able to move up into that race. But I think that her involvement in that has not made the other 2 candidates for mayor very happy, and I would anticipate that either one of them, if they were elected, would probably prefer Lamont and probably put their organization behind Lamont's candidacy. Right. So, and we're going to go back to the Richmond mayor's race, because that's another anomaly as races go for a lot of different reasons, going back to what they did in 2004. But let's go on and let's talk about Bobby Scott's race. So we've only got 3 Republicans. We've only got 3 Democratic Congress people. And that is Jerry Connolly, Don Beyer, and Bobby Scott. Now, it looks like Donald McEachin will be joining them, and we'll have 4, and woohoo, look at us. But what about the fact that there's been a lot of talk about Bobby Scott running or being appointed for Tim Kaine's U.S. Senate seat? You know, it's interesting because Bobby sort of has run a campaign for the Senate seat. And in most places in the country, if you run a campaign for a Senate appointment, the governor does not like it and won't appoint you. In this case, Bobby positioned himself very well very early, getting the legislative Black Caucus members to endorse his candidacy. And it's very difficult to justify why one of the 2 white guys from Northern Virginia, who are both much more junior in Congress, should be appointed over Bobby Scott, who's been there since 1992, and really is the backbone of the Democratic Party for the downstate vote in governor's elections. Who's everyone go to? The first person they go to is Bobby Scott. Help me in the 3rd district. Help me in the 3rd district. So it's very hard to tell him why he can't be a senator. And when he came out and openly said, I want to be appointed, and had people at the AFL-CIO convention chanting his name, it made it very difficult for the governor to justify anything else. Now, may the governor have preferred, making history with another African-American, say from the General Assembly? Perhaps, but he never really even had that opportunity. Well, okay, so hold that thought. When we come back, we're going to dig a little deeper into some of these races, specifically in Virginia, and how this presidential race that is taking place tomorrow is going to affect us here in the Commonwealth of Virginia with some of these seats. There is a tremendous domino effect, so please join us after the break.
¿Sabe usted que su voto cuenta? ¿Cómo votar en ausencia? Día de las elecciones es el 8 de noviembre y su voto cuenta. Su voz es su voto. ¿Va a estar lejos del condado de Fairfax en el día de la elección? Es muy fácil votar si no estás en Fairfax. ¿Usted trabaja o commutar más de 11 horas por día? ¿Es usted un cuidador principal de una persona enferma en casa? Estas son algunas de las razones por las que un votante registrado para votar en ausencia. Los votos por correo deben ser recibidos por la oficina de elecciones a las 7 p.m. el 8 de noviembre. La votación en persona ausente ya está disponible para lunes a sábado en las ubicaciones del condado de Fairfax, en el centro de gobierno, y los satélites hasta el 5 de noviembre. Para horas y lugares, visita el sitio web de la Liga de Mujeres Votantes. El éxito de nuestra democracia depende de la participación y tu votación de todos los ciudadanos. Usted puede ser la fuerza que provoca el cambio y el progreso en nuestro país. Que cuenta con su opinión, su futuro depende de su voto. Votación es realmente importante.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
To Inside Scoop. It is election eve night. I'm your host, Catherine Reed. Joining me tonight is Ben Tribbett, a very well-known, very sharp, very savvy sort of prognosticator on politics. So when we left at the break, we were talking about Bobby Scott, and you kind of made a case for why this is going to be a dilemma for the governor because of all the reasons that you've stated about his experience, his seniority, the fact that he would be the first African American to be a U.S. Senator. Virginia's never had an African American. Virginia's never had a woman U.S. Senator. So all of these things are kind of in the mix as far as the historical nature of his appointment.
So put it away. He's going to be your next U.S. Senator.
All right. So let's assume that he is. Let's just go on that. Who would then we're going to, so this is this ripple effect we're talking about. All of these special elections now come into play. So Tim resigns his U.S. Senate seat. Governor Terry McAuliffe appoints, let's say, Bobby Scott to fill it. Now we've got a special election outside the normal congressional schedule. Who do you see as throwing their hat in the ring on the Democratic and the Republican side for the 3rd District?
Well, the Republican side won't really matter for the 3rd District, but on the Democratic side, there are a number of elected officials. Remember, Richmond's now out of the district.
Okay.
It's in Donald McEachin's. So we're really talking about the peninsula down to Norfolk. And there are a lot of qualified Democratic.
Do you think it's going to be the
officials
schmozzle that it was in the 8th where we had 13 candidates?
Absolutely.
Oh my God.
Absolutely.
Total
chaos will ensue.
Oh man, that is just terrible. So what happens in those cases is that all of these people, many of them who might be in the Senate or in the House or
I'll get a free shot.
I'll get a free shot.
And it could be a I don't think they'll do instant runoff voting there. They haven't in downstate. They usually only do that in Northern Virginia. The party would have to put that in the rules, which means someone's going to win. Whoever gets the most votes out in a caucus, it's going to be a firehouse caucus that's probably held in each county and city, and whoever gets the most votes out will win the election.
Right. Okay. And you're not saying who you think any front runners are in that district?
I'll say this.
Okay.
The state senators have a leg up because they represent more people.
Right. That's true.
So, there's a couple of state senators down there that'll have a leg up, but the state delegates are going to have an opportunity too. There's mayors that represent a lot of people. Remember, major cities are in there.
Oh yeah, that's true.
This could be wide open.
Yeah. So that's just something else that everybody needs to keep their eye on.
And remember, in the 8th, everyone knew Don Beyer would win.
Right.
But anyone who looked at the math on day one would have told you Patrick Hope would finish second. And the reason was there were a bunch of Alexandria candidates, and there was not many Arlington candidates. And so that's what you have to watch for in the 3rd. You could have candidates, maybe you say Mamie Locke is a front runner, but she has a base in Hampton. Well, if the mayor of Hampton or other major candidates run out of Hampton, that's going to diminish her ability to win very quickly. So, you got to see who gets in and where mathematically do they have the best opportunity.
Okay, so let's talk about we'll go down a little bunny trail, sort of pivoting from the congressional races to talk about the 93rd House District. Monty Mason is running for Senate there. He is replacing
93rd, he's moving up from the 93rd.
Which is the House
first
District.
Senate seat.
So the first Senate seat.
To replace Senator John Miller, who just died.
Just died, right. And so Monty's in, so
Monty should easily win the Senate seat. That's been a redrawn Senate seat that's fairly Democratic now. He actually already resigned, so the special election for his House seat will be on election as well. The Democrats are heavily favored there. I actually saw a Republican delegate this weekend who told me that they expect to pick that up next year, but that Williamsburg is just not a place that they're going to be able to win in a presidential year.
Yeah, because that even when Monty Mason won it was close. That is one of those districts. And again, I think part of that is you have students at William and Mary down in Williamsburg, but you have a pocket of affluent white retirees that have chosen to make Williamsburg their home. And so all of these things tend to impact what happens in these districts. So we've got McEachin moving up. to Congress. We've got possibility of Bobby Scott being appointed to the U.S. Senate. So let's talk about who's going to run against Bobby Scott, let's assume that, on the Republican side. Because, you know, the last 2 elections with Kaine and Warner have not been easy elections. They have not.
Well, I actually was on a radio show last week, John Fredericks, and you know we do a show every few months called The Boys Are Back in Town. No women are invited. It's myself, Chap Peterson, Scott Suravel, Dick Saslaw, Dave Marsden, and Tom Davis. And we basically got an announcement out of Tom Davis that he will be running for the United States Senate should Raul Whitman not run. And I think that he will be the prohibitive front runner for the Republicans because of his ability to raise money and his base in Northern Virginia to win the Republican nomination, and probably the prohibitive front runner to be our next U.S. Senator.
Wow, okay. So that's kind of interesting because, you know, I said that I just heard this morning that somebody threw out Carly Fiorina's name. I never even think of her as being in Virginia, much less a possibility as a candidate for. Do you think, other than Tom Davis, there's anybody who can put up a pretty good contest for that nomination?
There's a number of Republican candidates that could run. It's going to be a primary. And so, remember, the Republicans selected a primary for next year. And in a primary, you tend not to have the activists controlling it as much. It's much more based on name ID. And it's hard to imagine how Carly could break through in areas like Northern Virginia and be competitive enough with Tom Davis that she could take him downstate. There's a whole host of other people that I think will run, other Republican congressmen, but no one has the base that Tom Davis has. No one has the ability to raise money that he has. And so he's far and away the prohibitive frontrunner. And
in a contest between Tom Davis and Bobby Scott, how do you see that going down?
It's tough for Bobby because Tom has such a good base in Northern Virginia, which is traditionally Democratic, and you have this Republican energy from having a Democratic president.
That's true.
So I think it's going to be a very difficult race for him.
Yeah, I think you're right. So let's go down another little bunny trail and talk about the Richmond mayoral race. You had brought up LeVar Stoney before. That has been kind of a wild and crazy race with lots of different candidates too. But despite the fact that whenever you have a large number of candidates, it completely fractures the vote. The base just splinters. You've got 9 different districts, and the winner of the race has to win a majority in 5 of the 9. Some of them are more
a plurality.
And so some of them are have fewer voters in them altogether. But it's
they all have the same population, but some of them have fewer voters.
Right, the same population, fewer voters. And so this came about in 2004 when they changed the model to a strong mayor. I don't even know what you call that.
Well,
model.
when Tim Kaine was mayor, he was a city councilman from the 2nd Ward, and he was elected mayor by the city council. So it wasn't until 2004 that Richmond actually began electing the mayor. It was after Tim left office, and so.
So this is the first time it's become a popularly elected office.
Right.
Okay.
And that's when the strong mayor began.
Yeah, that's why I didn't, and I kind of missed that whole strong mayor thing. I just know it happened in 2004.
Mm-hmm. And you know, Richmond has always been driven by racially split politics. And in the west end of Richmond, which is primarily areas that were annexed by the city for tax base, which are heavily white, that never really wanted to be part of the city of Richmond to begin with, they tend to unite behind white candidates to try to elect them into office. So people, when they were drafting the strong mayor in Richmond, even though it's a majority-minority city, saw this was an area where a small part of the city could potentially overwhelm the rest of the city and elect a candidate of their choosing that the rest of the city did not want, which is why they have almost an electoral college type of system where you have to win 5 wards. If you don't win 5 wards, the top 2 popular vote getters will move to the runoff, but in the runoff you'll also have to win 5 wards.
Yeah, this is crazy. The Richmond Times-Dispatch today had this article about the different scenarios that could come into being, and it looks like it's really come down to Joe Morrissey, who is technically, I guess, a Democrat, Jack Berry, who's been endorsed by some interesting people like Viola Baskerville, for whom I have the greatest admiration, and LeVar Stoney, who a lot of people see as a young newcomer to Richmond who might have credentials at a different level, but not necessarily in the city of Richmond. But he's raised a lot of money. He seems to have a good ground game. But there's still other candidates too. Now, John Belial's dropped out of the race, although his name is still on the ballot. So dropping out of the race, your name's still on the ballot. So how many people are even paying attention to that?
Right.
but he seems to have thrown his support behind LeVar.
You know, Joe Morrissey's going to carry 4 districts for sure: the 6th, the 7th, the 8th, and the 9th in South Richmond, South and East Richmond. And Jack Berry's going to overwhelmingly carry the 3 white districts in wards 1, 2, and 4. So it's really down to wards 3 and 5. LeVar only needs to win 1 ward, assuming that Joe does not win the other ward, in order to force a runoff. Because obviously, if the 3rd ward, for example, votes for Jack Berry and the 5th ward votes for LeVar, no one will win 5 wards. It's possible that Joe could win the most wards on Election Day and not qualify for the runoff because his wards have less voters in them. I will say this: I think the governor really put his finger on this, and he got this race right in the Washington Post last week. And when he said, they asked him about Joe Morrissey, he said, "I don't attack other Democrats." Jack Berry, who's, I think, what many people call maybe the front runner at this point because of the bad week that Joe had. I think most people would have said Joe was the front runner last week. Now, I think as of today, maybe Jack Berry's a slight front runner. Is someone who's really affiliated with the Richmond Republicans. He's driven by the Republican vote in Richmond. He gets money from the Republican Party. And I think that what the governor was saying there, if I can translate a little bit, is, you know, Democrats have got to elect a Democrat.
Right.
And when you have 2 Democratic candidates like this running, and LeVar obviously is a Democratic candidate endorsed by the party affiliated with the governor. Joe's a Democratic candidate who's actually served in office multiple times as a Democrat, a member of the Progressive Caucus in the legislature. The Democrats lose focus, and some of them actually shift into the Republican. They see the 2 Democrats fighting, and they say, maybe I want to be for Jack Berry.
Right.
And so Richmond's got to be very careful not to elect a Republican mayor. And I thought the governor really put his finger on that when he declined the opportunity to attack Joe and said he's not going to attack other Democrats. I was really glad to see that.
Well, so we've got some other, Lisa Merkel is running for mayor of Herndon. How do you see that race coming down? What do you think Lisa's chances are out in Herndon?
You know, Herndon had that huge turnover election a few years ago with the anti-immigration group. And so, you know, it's a little unpredictable. I think this is the first time they've gone to a November election.
It is. This is the first time that it's going to coincide with the presidential race.
And that was to drive up turnout. That having been said, when you drive up turnout, we have a lot of people voting in this election that never voted in a Herndon election before. I'll just say Lisa Merkel's a great mayor. I can't imagine how she could lose. That having been said, I couldn't imagine how the Minutemen could have taken over a few years ago either. So it's a small town. It's localized elections. Sometimes you can't see things coming. But if you had to put me down, I would say, you know, got to predict Lisa Merkel because, you know, she's been such a strong mayor. I can't see any reason why Herndon would want to get rid of her.
And she's an incumbent. And let's remember that incumbents win like 97% of the time. Incumbents win. That's just the way it is. And a lot of that's name recognition and it's relationships and its credibility and its visibility. I believe Jeanette Rochelle is running for mayor of Manassas Park, speaking of small places.
Right, and she's a heavy favorite there, especially in a presidential year. Manassas Park actually had a couple of candidates that forgot to file for the city council, so there are less candidates on the ballot for city council there than there are spots open. So there's a massive write-in campaign going for candidates to try to get that last council seat.
Holy cow. Well, that's breaking news right here on this show. You people out in Manassas Park, you got to get it together. When we come back from this break, it'll be the final segment of our show. We're going to be talking to Ben a little more about some of the local issues on the ballot that we all care a great deal about. So please join us after this break.
Hi, I am Peggy Knight, and I'm with the League of Women Voters of the Fairfax area, and I'm here to share information about Election Day with the viewing audience of the Fairfax Public Access Television area. Election Day is Tuesday, November 8th. Do you know that you can vote for more than just the president and the vice president? Every representative in Congress is up for election this year. But that's not all you can vote for on Election Day. There are 2 proposed constitutional amendments for Virginia. There is a meal tax referendum, and there are 3 separate bonds to vote on. For more information about these issues and the candidates, go to vote411.org. Remember, Election Day is November 8th, and your vote is your voice, and every vote counts.
One day these rats were playing in the woods. Well, it's a matches and that's no good. Listen to smoke before you give it a try. Only you. Don't play with matches. Don't play with fire. There's nothing very funny about ripped off life, nothing very nice on a homeless mind. So if a gorgeous force is what you desire, don't play with matches, don't
can prevent wildfires.
Fire!
Why don't you just wash your car at home?
When I wash my car, everything runs down the street and down into the storm drains. With all the chemicals in the soaps and waxes, the last thing I want to do is poison my own drinking water. At least here, it's all contained and recycled on site. That's why I also take my car in for oil changes instead of doing it myself. I might take a chance on spilling stuff. You know what the best part is?
What?
More time to kick back and watch the game.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome to Inside Scoop. It's election eve. I'm with you tonight before the election with Ben Tribbett. I'm Catherine Reed, your host. And Ben, thank you so much for being here. This is our last segment, so we have to squeeze it all in.
All right.
So let's talk a little bit about what voters are going to see in Fairfax County on the ballot tomorrow if they haven't already voted. We've done a lot in the last several months about the meals tax on this show. I've had Scott Serval talking about it, and Pat Hines talking about it, and John Cook talking about it, and a lot of people coming on to talk about how they see the meals tax. What do you think the chances are, and why?
You know, it's always hard to get people to vote to tax themselves. We learned that in the 2002 transportation referendum. I think it's especially hard in a place like Fairfax County because it's such a large county that getting the message out and being able to talk individually with people about why this is important to them is so difficult in a large county. I remember a few years ago, the Fairfax City Council put on a referendum, a 5-cent property tax increase to preserve open space, and it passed overwhelmingly. Because in a small place like Fairfax City, they were able to talk to each other and talk about why this is important. In Fairfax County, that's so hard to do because it's so large. And I really worry about all those voters out there that really no one's ever been able to talk to that just see this tax on the ballot and say, I don't know, why would I want to tax myself?
Exactly, and I mean, I think, and that's true, people just don't have enough information. It's also what you call it. Meals tax is not like a property relief or a property tax relief referendum. Even if it does the same thing, what you call it matters.
Absolutely.
You know, and that's one of the things that Congressman Jerry Connolly pointed out. He goes, with property taxes being the only source of revenue, that when you create another taxing or you create another source of revenue, you are providing tax relief. And there's a lot of people, especially on fixed incomes and older people, who need that kind of property tax relief, especially when that's how we fund our schools. So what you call it matters. And so let's just segue right into the right to work amendment to the Constitution. Like, do we need that?
You know, right to work is already a law in Virginia.
I know it is. We've already had it. We're a right to work state. That's what we're doing here for a long time.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I do this radio show every once in a while with Chap and that group. The next day afterwards, they actually did a more Republican-centric one out in Dick Black's office, and I went out and with Jennifer Boysko and Kathleen Murphy. And he was a great host, but none of us obviously had ever been to Dick Black's house before. And I sort of challenged him on this because he was promoting the right to work law, and I said, this is very similar to the Marshall-Newman Amendment that Republicans put in the Constitution in 2006 banning gay marriage. We could have just had a law. It would have been struck down by the Supreme Court. Now you have this thing in the Constitution that's not enforceable and makes us look like idiots. And with right to work, there'll be court challenges on this in the future. And if the Supreme Court later strikes down right to work, again, we're going to look like buffoons, and it's going to be in the Constitution where it's very difficult to remove. So it's definitely something that's more appropriate in my mind for a law. I'm sure you agree.
I do.
If you even think it's good enough policy for a law, but it's certainly not something that should ever be in the Constitution.
Exactly, because I agree with you. The last time we did this was 2006, and I was stunned. I really didn't think that people would vote for that. Silly me. But now it's stuck in our Constitution where it doesn't belong, and there's this whole long process to repeal something from the Constitution that I don't think people are interested enough to actually go through the steps to do it.
Right. It's going to be in there for a while, and it's just a complete disgrace.
It absolutely is. So let's talk a little bit about what we think is going to happen. So after this election, and let's say that Hillary wins and Tim is the vice president, and what point do you think Tim is going to resign his seat? And what is the domino effect of all of these special elections that we are going to experience between now and November 17th of 2017, November of 2017?
Well,
we got primaries mixed in there too.
Right. I think that Tim will resign probably after the lame duck session of the Senate is complete, there's not a lot of reason to resign before that. He's still obviously not going to be vice president until January.
Right.
So probably somewhere around the Christmas time when they get out of lame duck. The new Congress takes office before the president does. So he'll want to get out of office a few days before the new Congress comes in, because that will give whoever his replacement is a slight seniority heads up on the incoming new members. And I know he'll want to give that to the next senator from Virginia rather than place them a little bit behind the new members.
Do you feel like it's going to be a congressperson? I mean, we keep talking about Bobby Scott, so
I think it's going to be Bobby Scott. I think it's no question.
Right. So then, at such point as the governor makes the determination, at such point as he announces that he's made the determination for the appointee, realistically, how far out do you have to allow time for, a special election for that congressional seat? I mean, and are primaries involved? I mean, you've got to nominate, and then there's a general election, special election. Like, how many steps are there to all of this?
Primaries are generally illegal in special elections, so it'll be a firehouse. Usually the special election takes place about 3 to 5 months after the seat is vacant. So you're probably looking at April, May as the special election, and then you have to work back from that for the nominations. You need to have your nominees in at least 45 days before the special election. So we're probably looking at a February Democratic caucus in the 3rd District. Maybe early March.
Okay, that totally makes sense. And so same for Donald McEachin then?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so
actually Donald McEachin's will be a little bit even faster, because when he wins, his seat will be vacant. He'll resign almost immediately.
Right, and so will they try to do that because then session starts, right? Like that's the whole thing.
So they'll want to get that in before session happens. So that probably is January special election, probably December caucus.
So that is like super short for his Senate seat.
Be very quick.
Okay. And so we're thinking Jennifer McClellan or somebody.
Lamont Bagby.
And Lamont Bagby. Okay.
Yeah, those are the two. They're both delegates. Those are the two front runners.
Okay. And so
I know you're promoting Jennifer. You like all the women, so.
Well, yeah. Okay. So let's just talk about it. Can we just talk about it? This state has had no woman governor, no woman U.S. senator, and it looks like we probably won't again for a while if Tom Davis is going to be running. But yeah, I mean, we've got one congresswoman out of 11. We've only ever had 4 women representing us in Congress.
So does this mean you're supporting a woman for lieutenant governor next year?
Well, I tell you, I think we have very qualified women who are more than capable of running for lieutenant governor. And
Can I talk about one of them?
Sure. Talk about one of them.
I really like Eileen Fillerhorn.
I do too.
And I think, I actually helped Eileen on her first campaign back in 1999. I think she's going to be an outstanding statewide candidate. It's a tough year next year.
It is.
It's not going to be an easy year. There's other good candidates who are running also. But Eileen, to me, is someone who has earned it. She's been in the trenches. She's earned the shot to be on our ticket. I think that it's very important we have a woman on the ticket next year. You have 2 white men that are anchoring either side of the ticket, with Ralph Northam for governor and Mark Herring for attorney general. And I think that having a woman on the ticket with them would be very helpful. I
think so too. In that lieutenant governor's race, what do you think about who's going to be the nominee on the Republican side? Because I've heard, Jill Vogel is a very interesting person.
Absolutely.
Same category as some of these, Barbara Comstock won because she's got skills and she's valid and she's credible. So is Jill Vogel. And Jill has a voting record that has, built networks of people when she supports. I sit on the board of Equality Virginia. So she has in the past supported some of our issues for fair housing and for employment non-discrimination. So she, to us, when I wear that hat, looks like a more appealing candidate than some of the other Republicans that are running.
And when you put on your NARAL hat, you don't like her transvaginal ultrasound, right?
I don't. So wear a lot of hats. I wear a lot of hats.
You can take them on and off. But
I do.
Jill's a good candidate. Now, will she get the nomination? I don't know. I mean, I think that one is wide open because it's going to get so overshadowed by the governor's primary, the Senate primary. Will anyone even be paying attention by the time they get to lieutenant governor for Republicans next year? I think that Jill will be helped by the fact Tom Davis is running for Senate, which will drive a Northern Virginia turnout that's more moderate. And I think she'll do well in those moderate areas. But it's the lieutenant governor's one's hard to predict because I guarantee if you polled it right now, no one's even at 10% of the vote. No one knows who any of these candidates are. And Jill has to show she can put together a real campaign. On paper, she's a strong candidate. But we're not past that paper stage yet where we can really see, are they actually real candidates? On paper, last lieutenant governor's contest they had, their 7-way Republican contest that ended with E.W. Jackson winning.
Oh, I know.
Steve Martin from Richmond was the only Richmond candidate, a state senator from there, should have been run away with it. He got 2% of the vote at the convention and finished last place and was off on the first ballot. So on paper, it should have been him. But sometimes the paper candidates just don't, it does something.
Well, I mean, the Trump ascendancy is absolute verification that the most unlikely people can end up prevailing.
Absolutely.
In a field of qualified candidates. So with Eileen, Gene Rossi has declared he's running, Justin Fairfax has declared he's running. She serves in the General Assembly. Like, she works in our State House, and she will be in session from January to March. So
can I just say this about Gene Rossi and Justin Fairfax, both of whom I think are really good people and could be good elected officials. Neither one of them has enough political experience, I think, to fully grasp and understand how they will be perceived in a general election against a Republican legislator when they've never held elected office running for lieutenant governor. Have we elected people that didn't hold office before? Yes, but they were extremely successful businessmen, whether it was John Hager, who was a tobacco executive, Don Beyer, who was so well known as a car dealer up here. You otherwise need elected experience, and I think that the Republicans will have, if it's Gene Rossi or Justin Fairfax, a field day with ads that are saying this is not someone who you know enough about to elect as lieutenant governor. It's going to be very, very difficult for them. And, if I were advising them, I would say step back. People are always going to surround you and tell you to run because political consultants surround you so they can make money off your candidacy.
Right.
No political consultants ever made money off telling their candidate to drop out. No one's got a dropout bonus.
True.
I need to start writing that in for candidates I'm working for, a dropout bonus, right? But so your people around you are going to say, run, run, run. Sometimes you have to step back and say, no, I'm going to find something else to do, and I'm going to get myself more credentialed to run. And whether that's LeVar Stoney in Richmond, had he run for city council, he'd be a much stronger candidate for mayor in the future. Justin Fairfax, he was a sitting state delegate. If he, moved, I think, 100 yards from where he lives now into Eileen Fillercorn's House seat and represented the 41st in the House, 4 years from now, he would be a great candidate statewide because he's dynamic, he's a great speaker, he's a good guy. But when he goes up against the Republicans, which he hasn't experienced yet, they're going to have him for lunch because he doesn't have any background that allows voters to understand who he is. And it's so hard to introduce yourself statewide to begin with. You need to have a base of people that really know you and know your record. Or you need to be able to self-fund. And that's why I think that Eileen's our strongest candidate, and maybe the other two ought to find something else to do.
Okay, last thing before, as we're wrapping this up, who do you think is going to be the Republican nominee for governor?
Ed Gillespie.
Ed Gillespie, do you really think so?
Yep.
And what do you think his chances are?
It's going to be a competitive race. I mean, this governor's race is going to be very exciting next year.
Oh, wow. I can't wait. So on our ticket, I think I'm feeling pretty good about Ralph Northam and about Mark Herring running again. And I think that we have a lot to look forward to as our ticket starts to line up.
Right. And don't forget tomorrow, vote for Luann Bennett. Vote for the meals tax.
That's
in
right.
Fairfax County, and get a milkshake at 29 Diner, the only restaurant that supports the meals tax.
That's right, the 29
John Wood,
Diner.
let's give him a shout out on the show.
Shout out to John Wood 29 Diner.
A restaurateur who actually cares about the community.
Absolutely.